In Marvel Rivals, there are 3 core strategies that make up every single composition. That would be poke, dive, and brawl. And each one of these compositions want to win in entirely different ways, and if you know exactly what they're trying to do, you can make counter plans, or you can enable those plans' success. Now, before we talk about every single character and tell you exactly what composition they fall into, let's break down the 3 comps and give you tips and tricks about how to play them. First off, we have Poke, a composition that is centered around long-distance trading of damage and cooldowns. You're constantly keeping your distance, trying to find angles so that you can deal damage to certain key targets, and slowly whittling down enemy resources in order to leverage an advantage. Now, if you need a visual for a Poke composition, think of a Magneto combined with a Hawkeye and an Adam Warlock. None of these characters want to fight from close range to the enemy team, at least until they get substantial advantage. They want to trade damage from range, and they want to slowly generate either value, picks, or whittle down enemy resources before they press or be aggressive. Now, there's a ton of strengths for a Poke composition. Number 1, you are always keeping your distance from your opponents, and if you do this correctly, if you keep proper spacing, enemies are outside of their effective range while you're within yours. Like if you're a Hawkeye, for example, up against the Thing wants to come in close and fight you from his effective range, but the burden is on him to close in the gap, because the entire time that he's away, you are constantly generating pressure, picks, and getting value while he is doing next to nothing. Poke compositions oftentimes have an advantage in what we call the neutral fight, because opponents have to initiate or make some sort of play in order to get into their effective or optimal engagements, while you just simply have to maintain a certain range and constantly back away from opponents until you get an advantage, and you will win fights consistently. Another massive advantage of Poke compositions, especially in ranked play, is that Poke compositions do not require a ton of teamwork to execute. We're all just trying to take angles within a reasonable amount of distance from the primary tank. We're all just trying to output damage and abilities. We're all just trying to generate damage, picks, and value, but we're not necessarily doing it together. I don't need 3 people jumping in on a target or closing in on them once I've done damage to them, and there's also no risk involved when it comes to closing out a certain kill. Like, let's say I'm Hela and I dink someone and they're hiding behind a piece of cover. I can communicate that to my team, and they might take an angle on that person or apply pressure to them or shoot them if they see them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to put themselves in harm's way to do so, which is asking a lot less from your teammates. Now, the next composition I want to talk about is Brawl. And a Brawl composition plays out just basically completely opposite of a Poke composition. Instead of fighting from ranges, you're trying to close in the gaps and fight people incredibly up close, typically characters that have very close effective ranges. So, you know, the Thing was the perfect example of a Brawl, a character that wants to literally fight from almost point blank range and wants to close in that gap as much as possible. And a Brawl composition also has a certain amount of pressure involved. So instead of people actually just outputting damage in a general direction from like your side of the battlefield to the opponent's side that you would see mostly in Poke compositions, Brawl operates more as a ball, like a giant glob of damage and pressure that wants to just walk on top of small isolated blobs and just murder them. Sometimes there'll be characters that can actually force the brawl through. So let's say you're playing Bucky, Mr. Fantastic, and Groot. Not only can you grab someone into your team, you could pull someone into your team, wall them off, and then just kind of collapse on top of them and just basically murder them out of nowhere. And there's some crazy strengths to a brawl composition. And I think the first one has to do with the fact that you can basically turn a small advantage into a large advantage very quickly, because once you kill the first person, there's a lot less to stop you from killing the second person and the third. It's a composition with a lot of built-in momentum that is a also proactive composition that will take the initiative, because I think one of the weaknesses of Poke is that oftentimes everyone's doing a little bit of their own thing too much, and there's no central focus for your aggression or the team fight. But with a brawl composition, you have your tanks doing very specific things, typically on the front line where you can see them and everyone can focus on the same target, and when people die, the next target is clear and the team fight basically collapses in a very linear way. Now, there are some tricks to a brawl composition. It's really described by its close effective range, and most characters that are playing in a brawl composition need a way to close in the gaps, and most of the time that comes from using the terrain and trying to route on top of your opponents. You never want to give your opponents too many shots from distance where you're not effective. You want to find situations where you can kind of navigate to be directly on the people that you want to fight. And if you're fighting a Hawkeye from point blank range as a thing, you're having a great time. But if you're fighting him from across the map, you're probably going to take a lot of unnecessary damage. But most importantly, you're not going to be able to apply any pressure to him to stop him from peeking your supports and potentially getting a kill. This is also why Brawl gets stronger and weaker depending on the map. Really long range open maps, Brawl can start to suffer, and high ground maps as well. If there's not an easy way to route to the high ground, Brawl can be a bit difficult as well. But on some of the closer range maps or maps with a lot of corridors and turns and tight areas, Brawl gets better and better because you can force those close range engagements a lot easier. Now, the last but certainly not least composition is a dive composition. This is centered around mobility, where you are surgically trying to find a character on the enemy team or a couple of characters and pick them off directly by jumping onto them, closing in that gap similar to a brawl, but using your mobility to be very specific about who you target. While a brawl composition might constantly deal damage to enemy tanks on the front line or just try to push their team up against an enemy team that is less suited to fight a brawl or close range engagement, a dive composition might have weaknesses up against a brawl, up against a dive, if they do not get an initial pick off of a key vital piece. So as an example, let's say there's a Luna that is keeping up a brawl or poke composition, but if that Luna is specifically targeted, dove by people with high mobility, jumped on and killed, the composition, even if from close range they have an advantage, in the neutral they have an advantage, they will still lose because they don't have the engine that keeps their composition up. This is why dive oftentimes sacrifices winning a long fight and winning a fight where the opponents get to meet them directly for instead a fight that never really truly fights fair, constantly trying to put your opponents off balance or killing a key target before the enemy team ever gets to really fight you in the cycles that they want to, and then you win the fight simply due to that raw advantage or the inability for the enemy team comp to function anymore after they lose some of their vital engines in a composition, whether that is a DPS that is applying a certain amount of pressure or a support that is providing healing to the team. Sometimes the composition stops functioning properly and doesn't provide enough sustain or pressure when they lose these core pieces, and that's exactly what a dive composition is trying to create. And to give you a visual example, let's think of a dive tank like Captain America and then compare him to a brawl tank like the Thing. Captain America doesn't want to meet the Thing and fight him directly. He will lose that fight the majority of the time, if not all the time. However, in a situation where the Captain America could go around the Thing, specifically killing the Thing's supports, he can actually fight a Thing in a brawl when the Thing is out of resources, doesn't have any teammates left or support left. So yes, he can brawl the Thing and close out the fight, but he doesn't want to start the fight as a brawler. He doesn't want to run up to the Thing and start beating on him at the very beginning of the fight without creating that advantage, but the Thing does. The Thing wants to directly fight the Cap because he's favored in that fight, he's favored in that engagement. So it's important to not just think about characters in one dimension, because a lot of these characters can play in multiple types of composition, but it is important to think about what your character does best and in what way can you create an advantage in a certain fight, and at what point did you get enough of an advantage to no longer play the strategy and instead just play to close out the fight. Because while Hawkeye is definitely a poke DPS, if you have gotten 4 picks and you're still standing really far back trying to snipe enemies from afar instead of closing in the distance to clear out the enemy team, you're playing wrong, because these core strategies are only meant to generate you sizable advantage, but after the advantage is received or earned, then you close out the fight and kind of ignore the composition, because you don't need compositional strength when you have overwhelming numbers advantage. Now I'm going to very quickly go through every single character and talk about how they fit into what composition and what are some exceptions, and give you tips and tricks along the way. But if you skip along, please smash the like, subscribe if you enjoy the content, and do me a huge solid and go check out my Twitch and give me a follow. I'm trying to get to 10,000 followers and I'm pretty close, and I would really appreciate it. But let's jump in. So first there's Doctor Strange, a character that is actually normally a poke character with a shield and the ability to enable long distance damage and to output distance damage himself. This is his most optimal composition, although he can actually play a little bit of the brawler style. He can be played in a brawl composition with large amounts of burst AoE damage around him, although it isn't most optimal, and against true brawlers he does have a disadvantage there. And then when it comes to dive, Doctor Strange really just doesn't fit a dive. He doesn't have a lot of synergy, although you technically technically could dive high ground pieces with your mobility, so it could work in a pinch, but it's not going to be most optimal. Next up is the Thing, and we talked about him extensively. He's a true brawler, someone that wants to get in and deal damage up close. While he can be played in a dive composition with other characters that have mobility and the means to get him in, he's going to be most optimal in a brawl-esque composition with the ability to abuse shield tanks, abuse frontline, and any close range engagement with basically any character he's going to be favored in, maybe outside of Groot, who denies him resources to his team. That being said, just because he plays well into a brawl composition, you don't always have to play him as a true brawler. I think he could be a great off-tank, anti-dive character in a poke composition, for instance. Let's say that you're playing a Magneto full poke composition and the enemy team is playing dive. While you're not going to be executing your core strategy, you can still play the Thing as an anti-dive threat, someone that is trying to disrupt the enemy game plan, and then you could pivot into closing out the fight with less of an advantage in numbers. While a true poke composition would probably want to get at least 2 picks before they close in the gap and kind of ignore their range advantage. If you have a Thing as part of your roster, then you can close it in a bit earlier than that. Then the next character is Venom, and Venom is going to be basically a pure dive tank. He's going to be most optimal in a dive composition. And this is typically going to come from him diving in on specific targets, baiting out cooldowns, and really paving the way for a lot of other high mobility threats. He can definitely be a disruptor or a complement to other types of compositions as well if the Venom's good enough, but most of the time this is a little bit anti-synergistic in nature. You ideally want a character to go in and be able to capitalize on all the cooldowns that you baited out. Like if you dive in as Venom and you bait a Loki totem plus a Luna snow freeze plus a Bucky hook, for instance, you want to be able to actually punish opponents for using all these things, and other mobility characters can do so a lot easier than, you know, a poke composition. The Hawkeye is not going to capitalize on the fact that Luna used her freeze, right? But the Black Panther might, or the Spiderman might. Then number 4 is Magneto, and this one's a little bit tricky because I think Magneto can actually be played in every single composition. While he definitely is most optimal in a poke composition, that's where he's going to fit the best. He actually plays reasonably well in both a brawl composition and a dive composition. And you're going to be like, Mills, how does that make sense? This character fights from distance. Well, there's a lot of things about Magneto that enable this. Number 1, he's incredibly self-sufficient and he can play in multiple different types of play styles, whether that means he's going really aggressively on his own off angles, or whether that means trying to constantly peel for his team, bubble his team, and enable them. Or with his bubble, he can enable brawlers like the Thing or divers like Venom. So he can be played in a lot of different compositions, and he's incredibly adaptable. That's why Magneto basically fits in any type of strategy, especially for ranked play, because his power is so adaptable. And one of the things you need to understand is that sometimes a character's power level can be high enough to where sometimes it will be played in a composition that doesn't necessarily perfectly fit it, but it fits it enough and they're strong enough to just make it work. The next up is Groot, and Groot can actually be a little bit hard to play because he's a brawler technically, but honestly he feels like he's much different than the other tanks in a fundamental way. That being said, under the existing categories that we have, he's definitely a brawler trying to create close range or isolated engagements, trying to cut off resources from one side of the team to the next, and is basically trying to create constant numbers advantage even though the opponent hasn't actually lost anyone. Groot is going to do absolutely best on characters that can punish enemies that he cuts off from resources, so characters that are not afraid to get in, fight in close, or close in the gap. A character like Bucky is absolutely perfect for Groot because they both brawl together and they brawl from close range. But if you pair him with a character like Spider-Man, they're never really doing the same thing. They are incapable of helping each other, and the cooldowns that both of them are baiting and the pressure they're applying oftentimes will not impact each other at all. Now for Thor, he's another interesting one because Thor has a couple of different types of play that he can play in. I think he's best in compositions that are centered around both brawl and dive. Thor is really good at adapting to whatever other tanks you're playing in your composition. He's a character that doesn't really solo tank particularly well, but as long as you have a core strategy with another tank, he can fit in and mold into that and still assist with that playstyle. But this makes it even more important to identify what your team is trying to do, because if you're trying to dive when the rest of your team is trying to poke, you're going to get caught out and killed. If you're trying to poke when your team is trying to dive, you are not making full use of the momentum and cooldowns that your team is baiting out. So that makes Thor incredibly adaptable usable, but he could be difficult for that same reason. Now, I actually have to add this on to the Thor part because in the rework, Thor got massively changed in the types of compositions he's best in. Like before, he could overlap with a lot of different types of comps, whether that is brawl, poke, or dive, with poke being the weakest of the three. However, due to the reworks, it has been changed overall, and he actually overwhelmingly overlaps poke as Thor, where he can poke and brawl and do a little bit of diving as well, at times in a hypermobility composition. Thor is still one of the most flexible tanks, capable of fitting a lot of different roles, but I did want to add this on here because the changes to his kit overall changes what types of compositions he's best and worst in. Now, next up in the tanking category is Hulk, a character that can be played in several different types of compositions, most notably dive and brawl. Because he can surgically jump in on targets, he can definitely bait out a lot of cooldowns and pave the way for other divers, and you can surgically attack certain things, but he also can get in there and just apply general pressure, closing in the gap, giving himself and his team shields. And really his worst composition being poke, I think he can actually play in it decently well just because he has a lot of flexibility and can assume a more off-tanking role similar to how Thor does, where he really just tries to pick apart what the enemy team is doing, deny them, or make plays to double down on whatever his team is doing at the given moment. Basically, he has really dynamic mobility and a unique enough kit that allows him to impact fights in a lot of different ways. And this really means that I don't really think there's a terrible composition for Hulk. As long as you have the skill to back the character up, I think he can fit in a lot of diverse compositions and still get value. Now, next up in the tanking category, we have Captain America, a character that I think is pretty purely dive with very, very tiny, slight amounts of brawl. Like, yes, the character wants to close in the gap like a brawl, but because of his lack of damage, he needs to be extremely surgical with who he's doing damage to. And oftentimes, Captain America mostly wants to use his mobility to target very specifically vulnerable characters like supports and apply extra pressure. And he's going to be baiting a lot of pressure, a lot of attention, a lot of cooldowns. So, of course, dive is where he's going to be most optimal. I think Captain America is fantastic when you combine him with any sort of high mobility DPS or even a support like Jeff. But if you find yourself playing this character in a non-dive composition, you can still get value, but it mainly comes down to denying the opponent's strategy rather than utilizing your own. So like as an example, let's say you're playing a poke comp and they're playing a poke comp. Well, you're not going to really bait out any cooldowns that are going to matter that much for the poke. No one's going to capitalize on those things. You can deny the enemy Hawkeye from taking an angle, deny the enemy Hela from taking a high ground. So basically, if your character that you play doesn't perfectly fit the composition, you could still get value in disrupting the opponent's composition. And in some cases, it's better for you to do that than try to double down on what your team is doing, because if you're not playing a character that fits it, it's going to be really hard for a cap to help out a poke. There's nothing you can do to help your team poke harder, but you can deny opponents' pokes, which alleviates pressure. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Emma Frost, which is definitely a poke and brawl tank, not a dive tank in any way. No mobility there. It's pretty much a requirement. But while the character pokes extremely well, can fight from range-ish, you know, you don't have super far distances, but you can enable a lot of long-distance damage dealers. That's why Emma works so well with other long-distance damage dealers and works well with Magneto, because she can not only provide damage from range and constantly keep her distance from brawlers, but deny brawlers and divers as well. So she plays that off-tank role at the same time as she applies damage from range. And then, in addition to that, she can play actually pretty well within dive, because, like, once again, if Groot walls something off, having a character that can just get in and close in that gap and basically pinch the team and collapse on them is really, really important, because you want to be able to kind of capitalize on those moments of isolation when you're walling off enemy teams, and that's what Emma gets to do. So Emma can play a lot of different roles, whether it's more anti-dive based or whether it's more poke, brawl aspects. But right now, because of the character's power level, I think that she slots into a lot of compositions that she might not naturally fit, but because she's so strong, she just works. And we talked about that earlier, how a character could be in a suboptimal comp, but their power level overcomes their deficiencies in that comp. Now, I did say that was the last one, but I actually forgot one. Peni is the actual last tank. And yeah, Peni is another tank that really operates on a very different spectrum than the other tanks. Poke, brawl, dive doesn't really fit what Peni's trying to do. Basically, what Peni is anti-area or anti-space. She's a spatial denial tank. And what this really means is that any character where their primary objective is to close in the gap and close in on space, Peni will be pretty good against. That's really what her core strategy is. So up against brawl, up against dive, she is denying the space that these characters need to move into and occupy, and that's how she gets her value, by generating picks, damage, and applying a lot of pressure to those people. But this also means that Peni's worst composition to fight against is poke, a composition that she just doesn't want to fight nearly as much because these characters operate from range and fighting from range, and this puts a lot more burden on her because instead of being able to hold space down and contest space, she has to actively go take off angles, set up plays. And while this is possible, it's a lot different. It's playing the character in a almost DPS sort of way. Yes, you have high health totals, but you're really playmaking oftentimes when you're playing Peni on attack in a very similar way that a DPS might. And on defense, up against brawl and dive compositions, you're playing in another very particular way that is centered around denying what your opponent's entire game plan is. It's fairly interesting, but also hard to place. And I do think that Peni is a character that is almost worthy of creating a new type of tank category for her. But let me know what you believe that to be in the comments down below. Now, I do think that tanks are the most important, but we have to cover all the DPS. I'm gonna rapid fire go through these DPS without a ton of context, just to give you what these characters are good or bad at. And yeah, in an effort to not make this video 2 hours long. Black Panther is just 100% in dive and nothing else. You need players on your team that are helping to bait out cooldowns, and if they do, you can be much more activated, and dive will do that. Human Torch is definitely a poke DPS, dealing damage from range and applying a lot of pressure from range, slowly whittling advantage until eventually you'll overwhelm the enemy team. That being said, right now his power level is high enough that he can be played in other types of compositions just purely based on that, and it's similar to Emma, what we talked about before. Now, Ironfist can be played in both a brawl and a dive. He has the mobility to close in the gaps and dive with his team, and if cooldowns are baited out, he can kind of just go crazy. But he also can just brawl on the front line, punching out enemy tanks, following up with his Thing or Groot, close in or pinch in small advantages. So yeah, he can be played in both, but he's not going to be great in a poke comp because he doesn't do any damage from range. Melee character, right? Ironfist is another flyer. Flyers are typically going to be poke, and Ironman is no different. He's going to be played best in a poke composition. Any character that wants to deal damage from range, slowly whittle down enemy resources, or generate an advantage with angles is going to be poke, and Ironman is no different from that. Now, Magik is another hybrid character that can be played both in brawl and in dive. Has the mobility to dive in, but of course, right now, Magik brawling is more popular and more reliable, simply due to the fact that if you're diving in by yourself, you're gonna get freaking stunned and murdered. I do think that you can dive in with Magik more if you have other divers once again, but if you don't, you could still fight on the front line, try to just apply a lot of pressure, bait out enemy cooldowns, really rely heavily on your health gain or health steal, your vampiric. Next is Mr. Fantastic, and I mean, he's basically a tank, and if he was a tank, he'd be a brawl tank, undoubtedly. He's not poking in. He's not really diving either. Well, you could technically dive with the character. Really, you're trying to brawl enemy teams, close in that gap, swing through a whole bunch of enemy teams. And one of the things that you'll see is that brawl typically plays really good against poke if they're up close. That's why the Thing and Mr. Fantastic are so good up against double shield comps like Strange and Mag, because you could deal damage to the shields, and if you fight them up close or generate close engagements, you're gonna win the mid fight or the team fight every time. Moon Knight is definitely gonna be poke composition. He's not gonna want to dive in at all, and he definitely doesn't want to brawl. While you can definitely play him in some of these compositions and just get value with them randomly, like in ranked play, most of the people aren't going to double down on the pressure that you're doing or outputting. But if you're playing a poke composition, trying to whittle down advantage, and you have a Moon Knight applying a burst of damage and crowd control from range, he can really help open up the fight and create advantages for your team. Next up is Namor, and Namor is definitely going to be best in a poke composition, but he has a bit of flexibility built into the character. One of the things that he's really good with right now is Hulk, who is a character that I think is very adaptable and can fit in a lot of comps. And basically, due to the power level of that synergy, Namor can just kind of see play based on his power level alone. Plus, there's playstyle differences you can incorporate. While you can just sit back and play a poke style, very at-range composition, you can definitely take a very aggressive off angle and follow up a dive, or play anti-dive, so you can just try to deny what the opponent's composition is doing. So there's a lot of different flexible ways to use Namor, and I think he fits in more than just a poke. And it's interesting because while his kit is suited for poke, some of the poke characters, or the most powerful poke characters like Hela and Hawkeye, are actually some of the best characters up against him. Psylocke is a true flexible DPS that I think is perfectly capable of playing in poke, dive, and brawl. Not only can you just follow up on what your tank is doing and generate ultimates in a brawl comp, but you can use your mobility to dive in with your team once you have baited out cooldowns or your team has to follow them up. And if you want to poke, you can just play on off angles, doing damage from distance, or basically denying enemy angles, you know, denying the peaks from the Hellas and the Hawkeyes. So there's a lot of different flexible ways to play this character, so she doesn't really have one composition that she has played best in. Punisher is primarily going to be a poke DPS. He doesn't really want to close in the gap and fight from super close distances all the time. While you could be like, hey Mills, what about with shotgun and team up? While this can be a thing, this is typically an extension of the natural poke nature of the character that wants space and angles, not really your primary strategy to fly in there with a team up thrown at you and just to shotgun down the enemy team. He's also a character that doesn't particularly trade damage well from close range. You know, like if we talk about, you know, Magik or Ironfist or the Thing, they all have ways to survive close range encounters and engagements. Punisher just simply does not. He's just trying to find these small windows of time where he can be proactive on the front line or in close range, but he's predominantly a poke DPS. Now, Scarlet Witch, I think, is most likely gonna be a dive DPS with the mobility to back it up. However, the character plays in a very disruptive fashion that I think kind of breaks away from some of the core compositions. Most of the time, you're either trying to deny what an enemy team is doing, trying to disrupt what the enemy team is trying to set up. This can include things like marking enemy dive DPS. It can include things like poking at the enemy backline and following up on your team diving in. And it can also include things like playing on the front line and just applying a lot of shield pressure with the Doctor Strange team up. Once again, a character that is hard to place, very flexible in their execution, but also a character that in her current state is really only a ranked superstar. We don't have almost any, if any, pro metrics to base her on. But of course, if the power level got high enough, I'm sure we would find her seeing play somewhere. Spider-Man is undoubtedly a dive. He's just a pure dive. He's not brawling on the front line. He is not poking from range. He is diving and disrupting. You don't have to play Spider-Man with a dive composition. It just makes it a lot easier. He can also just disrupt enemy teams and just provide chaos, but it's a lot easier to jump in as Spider-Man when there's other characters that are providing pressure directly or trying to bait out cooldowns that Spider-Man will not get hit by. Next up is Squirrel Girl, definitely a character that wants to play from range, so that means that they are a poke comp. You could maybe justify Squirrel Girl in a brawl-ish comp because she could stun enemies multiple times, but most of the time, Squirrel Girl is just gonna be a pure poke-based character, trying to deal damage from range, constantly keep ranges, and she's very similar to Moon Knight, where if you play her in a poke composition, she can force movement or punish enemies that are trying to hide behind pieces of cover. So, you know, your Hela hits a shot on someone, they're hiding around the corner, the Squirrel Girl can flush them out or kill them, just like the Moon Knight can, or these characters can provide enough damage and pressure to push people into spaces that they are easier to shoot or kill from other pokers on your team. Star-Lord, once again, similar to Psylocke, is a character that I think can play in a lot of different compositions. You can play him in a dive, you can play him in a brawl, just, you know, providing damage and pressure. In a poke composition, I think this is his weakest composition to play in because his neutral isn't as strong as someone like Psylocke, where he's fighting from true ranges, but he can just play a lot of denial of enemy strategies, mark people, deny what they're trying to do. So I do think that if you are playing Star-Lord in a poke comp, you want to be very disciplined with how you're playing, not necessarily trying to go in super proactive, chase people down, because you're just not going to have nearly as much follow-up, but you can help to deny enemies from pushing in, diving in, or whatever. You could be an anti-diver, you could be a punisher for people isolated on the off angles because you have great dueling capabilities and things like that. Now for Storm, she's basically a pure poke character. Wants to fight from range, allows your teammates to poke more from range. She typically just wants the fight to last a longer time because she gets advantage the longer a fight starts, and she wants to be dealing damage from range. Now, she technically could enable a brawl composition, but she's definitely at her sweet spot when you're playing a poke-based composition similar to the other flyers. They want to deal damage from range and generate advantages over time through angling and through just the natural distance that they have. Doesn't mean you're never closing in the gap, by the way, but you're only doing that once you generate an advantage, or there's a moment where you can make a play on like an individual that isn't ready for you, and then you can use your E to close in, deal AoE damage, and win that fight. Now for Bucky, he's a character that I think fits 2 compositions, poke and brawl. He can brawl in and grip people into your Groot walls and fight alongside a thing or a frontline damage dealer. And he can poke and deal damage from range. Even if he's not necessarily the best at that, with his bulky amount of HP, he can still trade blows favorably and output a lot of damage over time. And of course, he plays a really effective anti-dive strategy. So even if his team comp doesn't fit perfectly, like if your team is playing a dive, right, but they are also playing a dive, you can still play Bucky, even though you can't really help your dive if it denies what the enemy team is trying to do and it keeps your supports alive. So sometimes you just have an anti-synergistic comp, but it's what you need, and this is something that typically only happens in ranked play, but that's what we play. In pro play, people would typically double down on the same core strategy instead. Now for Wolverine, this is another interesting one that I think can play in both brawl and dive. That's where he's best at. You bait out cooldowns for him. He can jump in and be really aggressive and dive in, kidnap people. And then when he's playing a brawl, he's just really good at fighting on the front line, trading bros on the front line. He can close in, right? If you want to think of, is this character a brawl character? Just think of a tank is walled off. Is there a character that will push into a tank that is Groot walled off? If the answer is yes, they're probably a brawler. Like Mr. Fantastic, Ironfist, Magik. Like these characters are not afraid to push into a character that's walled off, but your Hawkeye isn't gonna do it. You know, he's not doing that. He's not a brawler. But the thing about Wolverine is he's once again like this weird type of character that I think fits in a very different way because his core gameplay loop is really kind of outside of traditional brawl, poke, and dive. Trying to kidnap a tank, mass crowd control is just much different, and you can make an entire gameplay loop about that. And that means that like you're playing a poke composition, you can still scoop a person and just bring them right into your team and y'all can kill them. But I will say that Wolverines that are really frustrated when they pull, you know, like the enemy Groot into their team and that person doesn't die and they're like, I pulled them into our team and they don't die. Most of the time that happens when you're playing a composition that is a dive comp because your divers are set up and not looking to follow that up. A poke comp because your team is not willing to push into that Groot even if he's out of position. But a brawl comp is always going to be able to just close in on that person. They're going to be right there. They're going to close in on that, right? You bring that group back to your thing, your Iron Fist, your Bucky. They're going to kill it, right? Like they're going to kill that shit very easily. And so that can be one of the things that might frustrate you is when you expect more from your team, but they really are not going to do what you expect them to because they're playing a different core strategy. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Black Widow, who is definitely a diver. No, I was kidding. It's definitely a poke. It's only a poke. That's the only thing this character really does. She's not brawling. She's not fighting up close. She has the capability to a little bit, but she's not running around and swinging at people from close range. And she's not diving in with your team, but she can use a dive to be effective. You know, if a dive team is creating disruption, she could take a really aggressive off angle and use that disruption to make plays. So I do think that she fits a dive comp better than a brawl comp, but she's definitely going to be a pure poker. That's what she is best at for sure, and it fits her identity. Now we're moving on to supports, and I will say that supports are more flexible in a composition than tanks and DPS are. I think that tanks are the least flexible most of the time. DPS are semi-flexible, and supports are the most flexible. Now for Luna can be played in poke, brawl, and dive. I think especially because of her snowflake, she's very good at enabling dive DPS. Because she has damage from range, she can basically apply pressure no matter what composition she's in. But here's the important part. How you play this character in the neutral and who you decide or prioritize to heal changes dramatically depending on the composition you're in. For example, if you're in a poke composition, healing up your frontline constantly isn't your primary objective. They are naturally going to take less damage and they're not going to die as easily because they're not out of position. But what is really important is that you allow your DPS to take more angles. This means that you're prioritizing healing your flying characters. You're off-angling Hawkeye or Hela, enabling these people because they are the catalyst to create an advantage for your poke comp. Now, this is not true if your team is playing a dive. If your thing is going in and constantly trading damage on the front line, you want him to keep doing that. And in that kind of comp, he becomes a high priority heal target to constantly keep up so that he can keep up his cycles, making sure that you're constantly healing him and enabling him when he's in and trying to heal him up to full very quickly when he's out. It's different from like a Magneto, because Magneto, while you do need to heal him and don't just let your Magnetos die, the way that you alleviate pressure on the Magneto is by enabling your DPS to create more plays and apply more pressure, maintaining their offensive off angles, which you can directly enable. You also will find more moments where you yourself can be proactive as well, especially if your opponent's playing a poke comp as well. You can find moments to deal damage, and you want to be a bit proactive in dealing damage. Now, for a dive comp, you typically just want to time your claps and, you know, your cooldowns based on their engagement cycle. You know, when they're in and fighting enemy team, you want to be applying pressure as well. So ideally, you're using your clap to do so. And then when they're back, you could just heal them up regularly before they cycle back in. Now, next up is Loki, another support that I think can play in all the compositions, poke, dive, and brawl, but is 100% going to play better in dive, poke, and brawl at the very end. And the reason that Loki doesn't play fantastic into brawl is because you don't want to have to use your totems to just keep people alive in the mid-fight. You want to use it for more playmaking or playmaking denial, and Loki gets a ton of his value from his ability to be aggressive with his damage and apply damage. So in a poke comp, he can take an angle by himself and apply damage to generate advantage with his team. In a dive comp, he can take an aggressive angle to follow up on the damage that his divers are doing. But in a brawl comp, a composition that primarily wants to funnel the engine, right? Funnel the brawl engine, where you really want to keep topping up your tanks and really enabling that brawl. He plays in that worse because he doesn't want to just sit there and just heal tanks all the time. He wants to utilize his strengths. And I'm not saying he's unplayable in that comp. He's just limited in how aggressive he can be and the types of plays he can make in that comp, and he's more free than the other ones. Next up is Mantis. Mantis is going to be at her best in a poke or dive composition, either damage boosting a poker to get, you know, more damage on an angle, whether that's a Hela, Hawkeye, or Black Widow, or, you know, damage boosting your Black Panther or your Venom diving in. That's where she's going to get the most amount of value. She also plays really well as a poker, just dealing damage from range and applying a lot of damage from range. Brawl, while she can play in it fine, like I said, most supports are pretty flexible in the compositions they can see play in. You are going to struggle a bit constantly enabling a front line that is just taking a shit ton of damage. Like, I want you to think about a Groot that constantly takes a ton of damage and then needs to be healed back up, and a thing that takes a ton of damage and constantly wants to be healed back up, right? This is what they are supposed to do. Like, they're doing what they're supposed to do. They just need the resources to do it. It's like they need that diesel, baby, and you're running on eco, okay? So like with some compositions, you're like, Mantis healing is plenty enough, but if you play in a brawl composition, you're like, holy shit, I cannot heal up these inters, but they might actually be playing well, and that's something that you need to consider. Next up, Adam Warlock, a character that I think plays best in poke by far. Long distance damage dealer, burst damage, really, really great in poke. Can actually play and dive a bit, long distance follow-up, can heal up divers really, really quickly, either in the fight or right when they leave the fight, which is nice. Brawl, not so much for many of the same reasons that Mantis is not great in Brawl. There's just not enough to heal up, right? Like, you're not going to be able to constantly wipe away the damage that your Groot or thing is taking on the front line, and you need to be able to. So I really don't think that Mantis or Adam are playable in Brawl. I wouldn't suggest it unless you're playing triple support. Cloak and Dagger, on the other hand, is great into Brawl. I think it's probably their best composition. They can work in dive. They can work in poke reasonably well. They still can enable their team, pocket their DPS, create angles, make plays, but they're going to be at their best, I think, in Brawl, with the means to constantly enable the Brawl tanks and keep them up, and also create playmaking opportunities from close range, whether that's blinding enemy teams or really allowing their team to utilize her defensive ult really well, because she does it from a close range. You ideally want a team that is not playing super spread out, right, and gets benefit from playing all super close up to each other. So yeah, Cloak and Dagger is flexible but good, mostly in Brawl. Invisible Woman, another support that I think plays best in Brawl and plays best in poke. You can kind of do both, where Invisible Woman can play a pretty aggressive off angle where she's still reasonably safe because she can jump away and go invisible, pull people out of position, try to create angles for your team. Like think about it this way. Poke is oftentimes just trying to get people in angles to generate that advantage, and people like trying to not die. So having certain characters that could pull people out of position and help your Hela get a kill, Hawkeye get a kill, whatever get a kill. That's going to be really great. Plays well in dive because you can pull people into your brawlers, pull them into close ranges. They can fight there. The only reason that she doesn't play perfectly in dive is because she has a range issue where she can't really heal people from very, very far distance away. Still can work. I think that Invisible Woman can actually still be played in dive. A lot of good divers don't really need to be healed while they're in the fight. They just need to be healed very quickly when they cycle out of the fight, and Invisible Woman can certainly do that. So once again, one of the many reasons why supports are very flexible. I think that you're not gonna like lose the game because you're playing an Invisible Woman with the dive. I think it actually can be fine. I just think you need to be aware of it, and your divers need to be aware of where they can even get healing from at what ranges, or else they're gonna be, you know, having expectations that are just not gonna be reasonable for your character. Now, Ultron is the newest support on the block that most adequately fits in poke compositions, capable of dealing damage from very far away, and can also constantly provide pockets to even off-angling DPS. Now, while poke is undoubtedly the best type of composition for Ultron, Ultron can fit flexibly in a couple of other types, whether that is dive or brawl. Dive, because he can do damage from ranges, he can still follow up on the dives with his damage as well, and he can also heal hypermobility targets while being a hypermobility target as well. So really, he can play into dive reasonably well, even if poke's going to be a bit better. And then surprisingly, especially in triple support compositions, he can play in a brawl because you can put your drone center of mass in a giant clump and it can get a lot of different healing out to many people. You get really fast ultimates and you constantly provide pressure. Although brawl is definitely going to be the worst of the three, Ultron is surprisingly a very flexible support that can play reasonably well in multiple types of compositions. And I think you can actually slot Ultron in all three styles of play depending on the composition that surrounds him. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Rocket Raccoon, a character that is certainly good in basically every composition. I think that poke, dive, and brawl, he can enable all of them. If you're trying to burst heal frontline tanks, he got that. If you're trying to deal damage from range, while he doesn't directly enable that, he can heal everybody up. And poke is a composition that really benefits from being able to keep someone alive or bring someone back, right? Especially in the poke mirror, where Helas and Hawkeyes are trying to find angles on each other, generate some advantage. Being able to have your Hela or Hawkeye lose a duel, but then come back and then have another shot at it, really freaking big deal. Of course, your ultimate plays well with poke as well. And yeah, I think that if you're playing dive, Rocket can position more aggressively and not get punished for it. He can run away. He can heal from range. And he's also just objectively extremely powerful right now. I think that he is probably the support that fits in the most amount of compositions. Yeah, I mean, he's just great in every comp. It seems good, huh? But this is a full breakdown to every single character and how they fit into certain compositions, as well as some tips and tricks along the way. But if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below, and do me a solid and give me a follow on Twitch. I would really appreciate it, trying to get to 10,000 followers. And come say hi, ask me any questions, and I'll see you next time.